Johnson, and this is focused on Liberia. Hit it! From Cape Mount to Cape Palmer, Mount Nimba to Atlantic Ocean, Obomi Hills to Pocondre, to educate, elevate, and promote. Yeah, focus on Liberia, for Liberia, Liberia, for Liberia, yeah. From Monday to Sunday, from Monday to Sunday, it's focus on Liberia. Talk about home affairs, in diaspora, current affairs, reliable information, history.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a new day broadcast where we delve into transformative dialogues about social justice and the voices leading a charge for social reforms. Here at a noonday, we explore the intersections of politics, culture, and tradition with the leaders who are reshaping our world for the better. A new day focuses on critical dialogues around justice with emphasis on gender justice to influence policies and contribute to societal shifts. Today, we have one of the leading voices beyond from Liberia and then beyond. Her name is Dr. Tanya Garnett. She's the director of the University of Liberia's IBB School for International Studies and assistant professor at the Honors College of Gender Studies and Interdisciplinary Research. She launched a feminist research firm, Noonla Research and Consulting, exploring the nexus between gender and development, stakeholder and community engagement, and sustainable natural resource management. Thank you today for joining us again, Dr. Garnett. I know she like for me to say Tanya.
Thank you, Priscilla. It's my pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, I can. I can hear you clearly. I am so honored to have you back. I know sometimes back you were here with us talking about how to negotiating with the patriarchy, and but that time you were talking to us from your hotel room from was it Rwanda?
Rwanda.
Rwanda, yeah.
Yeah. So now I'm
You're
actually talking to you from Monrovia, since we're
okay,
focusing on Liberia.
Okay, good to have you back.
It's my
so
pleasure.
you were so you were working on a research that time, right?
No, I think when I was in Rwanda, I was supporting USAID, like USAID Rwanda.
Oh, that's why
Yeah.
you were there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But you're always doing some research on you know. So this May 1st, you and some partners of yours that you're going to tell us about a little more, launch a new research. So I was so glad when you agreed to come to talk to us about it. It's like a breaking news for us. It was released in launch in May, and here you are talking to us about it. So thank you again. Tell us a little more about the research. I know I have it here and I read about it, but for the public's sake.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm a researcher really by training. And so I just am a social scientist. I'm very fascinated to understand, like you, I think we share that in common society, especially Liberian society is very fascinating society, so much to study. And we've barely begun scratching the surface of really understanding who we are as a culture and as a society. So this research project is in partnership with the Align platform. Align is basically a research firm or a research organization based in the UK that tries to understand more about gender norms and how we can transform gender norms for the better. And so this was a research project that actually took place over about a year across 3 countries: Colombia, Liberia, and Malaysia. And we were trying to really understand um, more about men in politics. So political masculinities is a simple way of just saying men in politics. What motivates them? What are the obstacles that they face? What enables them to really be pro-feminist, to really have a gender equality stance, really with the objective of trying to make progress to push and promote gender equality. And especially in Liberia, we've studied a lot about gender in Liberia, especially with the first elected female president in Africa. Liberia became really spotlighted for how women can rise to top positions of leadership. And so Liberia's been studied, but masculinities was an area that there wasn't a lot of research on. What is it about Liberian men that maintains the system that we have of gender inequality? And how can we study them better, especially men in politics who are in leadership positions and have a lot of potential to influence gender equality? How can we understand what motivates them and how can we support them? And what was interesting for this particular study, and it was very much a collaborative co-design, we had a really wonderful partnership with our colleagues in Colombia and our colleagues in Malaysia. And we really thought together, we spent a lot of time in our partnership. The Align platform was very intentional that the partnership would be one of collaboration. And so we really spent a lot of time, actually, a good part of that year was spent thinking about what the research is really about. How do we want to ask these questions so that you could really compare across the 3 countries? And so actually, there's a cross-country report that will be available on the Align website, and then country reports for each country. So for those who are interested in kind of understanding the overarching research, you can do more. But ours, the report that you have, Priscilla, is really just the Liberia report. So we really just wanted to understand across these 3 contexts, what is it
Okay.
that motivates, enables men in politics to be pro-feminist and to really drive a gender equality agenda. And
Okay.
interestingly, these 3 countries were chosen
That's where
because
I
we
was going to come.
yeah, the 3 countries were chosen because we had in all of those countries very clear what we consider feminist foreign policy. Basically, men in
Oh,
politics who say, we are pro gender equality, or as in Liberia's case, former President George Weah, who said, "I'm the feminist in chief." Right, and he used that term for himself, and so that's what really drew the attention of Liberia as one of the countries of the case study, to understand what does that really mean,
okay.
and how does that function, and does it really work, in the context? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. You answered. Yeah, I was going to be like, why Malaysia? Why Cambodia? I wasn't going to ask about Liberia.
Colombia.
I mean, Colombia. Why Colombia? Why Malaysia? I thought Liberia was just a giving. But thank you for responding to that. So, let's start from maybe the basics. What is tell us the definition of gender dynamics and the importance of understanding them in Liberia.
Well, gender norms, which is what the term that we use in the report, and the term
Okay.
that Align uses, and you letting me put my professor hat on, but we define gender norms as the roles that women and men play in a society. And it's important to study them because every context is different, right? Every society is a bit different. And so, depending on the context that you're in, the history, the political system, the traditional, norms of that country, gender norms change. And then gender norm change happens over time, and different internal and external factors can lead to gender roles changing. So, really, we define gender norms as what is considered to be normal for a woman
Okay.
and a man in a given society in a given time. And so, and how do we, if those gender norms are not serving us well how do we change those gender norms so that they are serving us better? Because in a society we're the people in the society, right? So we can change society if it's not a positive one. So we know that in Liberia and many places across the world, we have a lot of gender inequality. And so our norm is that women are always seen as below, less than, less value um, than men. And that, in our system, we know that that happens a lot. And there's been a lot of gender norm transformation in Liberia. That's one of the things that the study reveals that's been happening in Liberia. And there's positive movement, though very slow. Um, and still a lot of challenges that we have to overcome, especially because we know our levels of gender-based violence are very high in Liberia. And so that is an example that shows us that we still have a lot of gender norm transformation that's needed so that women can be at peace and safe from violence, whether it's happening in the home or in the broader society.
Okay. All right. And when you at the beginning, you mentioned that, or it's from the report, that there are men in Liberia, there are male politicians that are supporting gender equality. Uh, um, so what did you find out, that what influencing them?
So it's interesting because the study was very tailored and targeted. It wasn't a study just looking at everybody in Liberia and understanding what gender norms are. There are some
Okay.
studies that do that. I heard recently of there's a score, which is a social cohesion and reconciliation index that
Yeah.
this institution called SEED does, and that there's some broad, cross county research that's been done to
Mm-hmm.
understand, different dynamics, social and reconciliation dynamics. This is not that. This study was very targeted, and we wanted to understand men who were already somewhat pro-feminist. So men who already had a positive stance towards gender equality. And so we
Mm-hmm.
were able to identify those men, um, those politicians, those male politicians that had some kind of positive gender stance, and really unpack how they got there, right? What made it that you're a male politician in this generally patriarchal system, meaning a system that believes that women are less than men, but how
Mm-hmm.
come you're a political figure in the Liberian context, but you believe that women should have more political rights so that they should participate more? So we were targeting those men for our interviews, and we interviewed 10 male politicians at different levels, local and national. Um, and men in positions of leadership, I should say, because the military, we were also able to interview some people in the military, but they're not really politicians, right? But they're men in positions of leadership. And so we were able to ask those specific men, to understand their motivations, and almost like we want to breed more of those men. We want more men like those who will sign the gender quota bill and say, I believe that there should be 30% seats reserved for women in parliament, right? Those were the men that we wanted to talk to understand what made you this way and how can we bring more of that about. So we know that in Liberia, we do have some men that support gender equality initiatives. And so we were able to speak to some of those men and understand their motivations. Um,
So
and I
what?
mean, yeah, we're breaking down the report. You saw the report, and I hope that we can share the link to the report
Yeah, 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 yeah.
because
Sure will.
there's so much more that I'm not going to be able to cover all.
Okay.
But in terms
Let me
of, I
play.
guess, overall, we
Mm-hmm.
saw that if we look at just those, again, it's a small study, it could be, but it could be broader and wider. But just in terms of us kind of getting this study was very exploratory. We just wanted to kind of begin to understand. And then, of course, we have implications for more study and more research that could be done. But just from the 10 men we spoke to, we find them
Mm-hmm.
on a spectrum. You
Oh,
have
okay.
those men who that we call political opportunists, who use gender equality to advance their political career because they know that,
Mm-hmm.
for example, women are very good partisans. Women support male politicians, and they really get behind them and really help their political career, not necessarily because they are feminists or these men are not necessarily really genuinely interested in gender equality, but they understand that women are very powerful partisans and supporters. So those are on one extreme of the spectrum we call the political opportunists. Then in the middle we have the
Okay.
strategic supporters, So some male politicians who they're not necessarily really advancing gender equality, but if a reasonable bill comes up, they're happy to sign it because it makes sense, so they can support strategically. Sometimes they may be, well, you help me with my bill and I'll push your bill, just general political behavior in the way that we strategize and
Mm-hmm.
negotiate. Yeah. Um, and then, so those are the men in the middle. But then we have on the other side of the spectrum, the men who are really pro gender equality, who are actually developing initiatives, right? Scholarship programs for women, or they're investing in um, maternal child care, or they're really advocating for the FGM bill being passed. You have some of those men who are really very pro gender equality, and you can see that in their actions. I should mention too that in the other countries, it's going to be a very interesting, the overarching study with all of these three countries is going to be very interesting because Colombia is really far ahead of us in terms of having a pro-feminist political culture, much, much more than Liberia does. And so those men that they spoke to, many more of them were those kinds of actors, I think, really pushing different initiatives that you could see. In our case, we didn't have too many men. I think maybe 20% of the men we spoke to were really advocating strongly for gender equality and doing it in a way that was tangible and visible. Majority of the men probably fall between the other two categories of being strategic supporters when it makes sense, or just, advocating for gender equality because it's popular or it's good for their political career.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So those, those were kind of the general um,
Categories.
categories that we would qualify the male politicians that we spoke to. Now, the motivators, they're different motivators. You had some men. I think the most interesting motivation that we found was the fact that some men um, saw the example of strong women in their lives as the reason why they wanted to be pro gender equality. So many of the men spoke about their mothers, the difficulty that the mothers faced in a patriarchal society, but yet how the women were very strong and still pushed them to have an education. Or, for example, one politician mentioned that he lost his mother in childbirth at a young age. And so he didn't have his mother, but the other women in his lives, his aunts, his grandmother, took him in and really helped to raise him and made him into the man that he is now. So for him, advocating for women just made sense because he knew the impact of those women in his life. Or another male politician who mentioned that his wife, without his wife, that he would not be where he was because they met at a young age and she was brilliant, and he relied on her for advice, for information, for strategy, and he saw how brilliant she was and he noted that, or his classmates, they're brilliant, they're even smarter than me, but they would not make it in this context because this is not a context for women. This is a man's game, especially in politics. So some of the men had that reflection, and could really see that, it was a shame that we lived, as they said it, in a patrilineal society where everything was focused on the man and the male line. That's what patrilineal means. Everything is focused on the male line. So a lot of those brilliant women would not succeed, although they did see how intelligent they were, and how capable they were, but they could understand, or the women in their lives just had such a positive impact on them that they wanted to advocate for other women to be able to do something. Another motivator was just also um, the importance of having women participate in Liberia's development, right? We know that Liberia is a small country. We only have 5 to 6 million people and a lot of development challenges. As we say in gender training, it takes two hands to clap, right? How will you develop Liberia in the way that it needs to be developed with only half of the population participating? Right, half of the population educated. And so a lot of the men saw the importance of having women, doing gender equality meaningfully, to have more women participate so that we could really progress the nation. They were very progressive, right? It was a progressive mentality. But what we discovered was it wasn't feminism, right? Feminism was not the reason that a lot of the male politicians, did what they did. It was, the moral imperative. Well, we have to. Some of the men said, but it's not fair. Look at the injustice. The way that women are treated in our society is an injustice, especially in terms of gender-based violence. So we have to do something about it. It's something that is not because I'm a feminist. And none of the men saw themselves as feminists, which is not a surprise for those of us who know our context. Feminism, we even heard some of the men say, or actually it was a female activist, because we also interviewed five female activists, academics, politicians. One of them said feminism is a dirty word in Liberia. Nobody wants to identify as a feminist. Not even female politicians want to identify as feminists, let alone male politicians, because it can be very isolating for their platform, right? Especially in a context where feminism is misunderstood, it's not a concept that's
Articulated.
not well known, and there's a lot of misunderstanding around it, right? A feminist is seen as somebody who's bitter or angry, or it's seen as lesbianism, right? If you're a feminist, it means that you're gay and you're not interested in being married or having children, which are all, of course, very, very misconceived notions about what it is to be a feminist, especially when we look at the definition of feminist, which just means someone who advocates for the rights of women, and we know that we need that in Liberia. We need the advocacy for women's rights, because women are suffering, really suffering, and especially in our Liberian context, women are suffering from gender-based violence at a large scale, let alone participating politically, right? Of course, we want women to participate, but we also really just want women to be safe. And in our context, it's a difficult reality in terms of gender-based violence that women suffer. So it was really interesting finding. I think that was the surprising finding, that it was the women in strong women in the politicians' lives that really had them in this pro gender equality and feminist stance.
Okay. Um, Normally I would stick to my questions and then later go through but I see I think you'll find this interesting. I never thought of this question, but a viewer has this. He says his name is
Mm.
River Pro. He says that your research take into consideration the ages of the men who support women. Other men will support a female. That's what he says, or he thinks female involvement in politics. Younger guys may have a different view. Did you consider
Generally,
age?
we
Oh,
did look at age, but majority of the men that we spoke to were kind of older politicians. So we didn't have enough contrast between older and younger politicians to really be able to say, it's
yeah,
different. I will say that out of the men that we interviewed, the only one that said, "Yeah, I could consider myself a feminist," was the youngest one. The youngest politician we spoke to, he said, but then he still had to clarify. He said, "Well, yeah, I could consider myself a feminist, but not really feminist, like militant feminist, more feminist, like, I really want women to participate, and I think that women are very capable." So I think age,
that's
probably, if we were to
interesting.
do more, yeah, if we're to do more, and we had more people, more than 10 politicians, I think we probably would find that the younger generation would be a little bit more open to that term, because it's less strange to them, right? They've grown up, and then think about it, our younger male politicians have grown up with a female president, as a norm in their lives, right? If we consider young, maybe to be 40 or below, you were in your 20s when you had a female president, right? So then it wouldn't be quite so strange. And that was one of the other enablers that we saw for men, political men being pro-feminist, was the example of strong women in positions of leadership. Of course, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was noted by several, men saying that, well, we saw her lead this country and lead it actually quite well. And so she really helped to change our perspective around what female politicians could do, and that women really could serve in leadership and be strong. Our whole Iron Ladies concept, that we have these strong female politicians who have shown us that it's possible for women to lead well. And so I think younger generations of male politicians, it was normalized for them more so than the older generations. But we didn't really have enough younger politicians to really be able to say definitely. But again, this was a very qualitative research study, right? So it was exploratory,
Okay.
asking very targeted questions of this key population of male politicians who were positive, had positive stance towards gender equality.
Yeah. Okay. And can you please unpack this? Well, I think one of the things the research, your report, found out is that there is distrust and skepticism, and you mentioned that among youth. No, you didn't mention the youth part generally,
Mm-hmm. There's
but
youth. Yeah, yeah.
amongst youth and civil society activists regarding male politicians' commitment to gender equality. They feel that actions by male politicians are often seen as insufficient and driven by self interest. I'm more curious about the youth. So, does that mean youth are paying more attention now? Anyway, just unpack this part for me or for us.
So I should say first that we spoke to university students, and so this may not be your average youth
You,
that you
okay.
find in the market or on the street. These are educated youth, but we did do rural and urban. So university students in the urban area, university students in the rural area. We didn't see too much difference between the urban and the rural, but these are university students, all in some kind of social science background. So they kind of have more of an understanding about what gender equality means, even if they're not really
Okay.
studying gender, but they have some kind of notion about what gender equality means. And so that was
Good.
our youth, cohort that we spoke to. So just to highlight kind of, the study, of course, goes into the methodology of exactly who we are talking to. So it cannot be generalized for all youth. But out of the youth that we spoke to, they felt that, the way that politicians use gender equality and say, for example, "Oh, I'm a feminist in chief," that they didn't really believe that was the case. They felt that that was more so just something politicians said to earn votes, and that there was actually no tangible evidence that these male politicians were really doing things. That they saw more so politicians being very self-interested, that when politicians reach a certain level or they get elected, they are not really interested in their constituents. They're only interested in their own family and their friends and their own political interests, or maintaining power, staying in power. But they had a general distrust. So they would say, for example, and we started all of the focus groups with an icebreaker. Like, did you hear, that former President Weah said that he was a feminist in chief? What do you guys think about that? And most of them were like, he just said that so that, to please donors and to please
Doesn't
voters. He's
even
not
know what
really
that
a
means.
feminist in chief. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, they said, well, he's not a feminist in chief because he hasn't really done a lot for women. He hasn't done enough. So how can he can say it, but are there any actions to actually show that he's a feminist in chief, that he really stands by that? Has he started scholarship programs? Has he, some students said, well, he has elected quite a few women in positions. If you look at his cabinet, there's some women that are in cabinet. So there was there's a lot of debate going on among the students. But overall, we saw that students generally, not just President Weah, but generally they felt that politicians um, did not really honor their word and were very self-interested. So even if they said they were pro-feminist or pro-gender equality, in reality, there wasn't enough. There weren't enough initiatives. There weren't enough women represented in political parties. That came up specifically. They spoke also of the quota, right? The neck law to get more to get seats reserved for women that many other African countries have enacted. Some of them even more than 30%, 50%, for example. And so they mentioned that as proof that a lot of politicians were just saying it, but they weren't really standing behind it.
Okay. All right. Let's look at a little bit of the cultural context. Um, Traditional gender roles in Liberia is shaped by cultural institutions like the
Hmm.
Sunday and Poor societies. Um, so And I think the report says that this contribute to gender inequality. The reason why I'm sounding unsure about this is because, but let me just end my question. And then the other one is that the history. No, let's take it one at a time. But let me tell you
Yeah.
the reason because um I think I listened to you and Dr. Burr and somebody else one time, and he was
Yeah,
talking
Counselor
about,
Yeah, Power One.
yeah, and he was talking about um our history and how the Sunday and the Poro work to they they kind of complemented each other, that there isn't hierarchy. But what does it sound like your report is suggesting that this contribute to gender inequality?
So that's a very complex question, and I think Liberia again is and a social scientist. There's so much research to be done, because there's a lot when we look at African feminism, which is a whole field of study, and not just what feminism looks like when it's coming from the outside in, because we always assume that feminism is imposed from the West. But there's actually a whole study of how feminism has also been growing from within Africa for centuries. We were not left out of that debate. And actually, West African women, I think this is what I might have mentioned in the discussion with Dr. Burrows. West African women are understood in the literature as being the most empowered. And one of the reasons that some theorists say that West African women are most empowered is because we have separate schools. The Sandy and the Poro are our traditional schools, and we have separate schools. Women have their own school, men have their own school. In some other African contexts, women don't have a separate school. Women don't have a school. It's just the men that organize themselves, right? And women are not really organizing themselves. But in West African society, the separate schools, some actually see as a means of promoting gender equality, because women have their own safe and sacred space for them to get together, for them to discuss their challenges, for initiation rites, for older women to teach younger women, you know, skills, home skills, life skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the literature, that's actually seen as a positive thing. Now, we know that in our context, those two schools are not 100% equal. The men's school is still seen as higher than the women's school, right? Than the women's society. The poor society is still seen as superior. In subtle ways,
Really?
for example,
Oh, okay.
yes, because for
Maybe in
example,
some way.
um, you can have a man represented in the Sandus society. And when they're having their initiation rites, for example, a man needs to be there. And in the other way around, a woman cannot necessarily be represented in the man's school, right, in the poor society. So there's some, things like that that show us that the societies are not exactly equal. Or it might just be that from the Sandus society, only older women that are post menstruation, elders, are allowed to join certain important initiation rites within the man's society. And so we also know in our society we're very ageist, right? Elders, we venerate our elders. When you're older, you are respected. So older women may be respected more so than younger women, right? Um, so there's been some research around how our schools are actually a positive thing. Now, the conflict is regarding what we call harmful traditional practices, right? So there may be certain practices within the Sandy and Poro society that are harmful, and so it's those specific practices that we need to eliminate or alter, not necessarily the whole school itself, right? So it's not that the Sandy and Poor societies are bad, because they actually are a way of transmitting culture, knowledge, understanding, even, for example, herbal remedies, right? Learning how to prepare different natural remedies that in other societies are very venerated. In Asian culture, for example, Chinese medicine, the passing on of these traditional knowledges, we can say, because there are multiple knowledges, those are very important in a society. So likewise in Liberia, the Sandy and the Poro have an important place in the transmission of understanding and knowledge from one generation to the other. So it's not the overall school that is problematic, but certain specific practices within the school, for example, FGM, uh, female genital cutting or mutilation, FGM or FGC. So I think that maintains what we talk about in the report is that I mentioned that specific issue in the report, and I talk about other authors who have said the same thing, that having a separate school for women is actually a good thing. Um, I think what we're talking about when we talk about traditions is the fact that in our traditional society, we're still very patriarchal. We're still very patrilineal. Men are seen as the leaders, and women are important supporters, but men are still the leaders within the household, within the society, within the community. And that often is seen as women should not lead, right? So because men are the leaders, women should be relegated uh, to almost like the second place, that they should let men make decisions and then they just participate in those decisions, but that women are not really in the decision making seat. And we see that at a community level. We also see that at the national level represented in politics, because we really do not have a lot of women represented on a large scale. And I mentioned in the report there's a gender equality or gender inequality index, the GII, and Liberia ranks very low on that index. I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe
Yeah.
fourth to last. Out of all of the countries in the study, Liberia is one of the very last, and that, for example, is looking at the number of women in parliament, right? So we don't have a quota, and women are not more than 30% represented um, in our parliament or in our house or in our senate. And so that's one of the things that we use to judge the level of gender equality, whether women are really in the decision making seat. Another interesting study that we looked at uh, was a study that looked at actually political party composition, right? Women may
Mm.
be partisans, more than 50% of partisans in some parties are women, but women are not making up party leadership. They're not in the decision making seat. And so it's not that women aren't participating, or that politicians don't see that women are important partisans. They do. They know the force that women have when they support you. But there's still this patriarchal mentality that women are not natural leaders, that women should be kind of relegated to the home sphere. You should be home, you should be with the children, you should be cooking, you should be taking care of home affairs. That's your realm. This public realm, this is really still for men. And we still have that attitude. Yeah.
And I think that like became really exacerbated, like as indicated in your report, by the history of violence we've had and conflict, which also play a
Hmm.
significant role in shaping what you term as political masculinity.
Hmm. And the general violence, post-conflict societies, because of the violence that becomes so normalized during conflict.
Mm.
I think that's part of Liberia's social fabric that we're still trying to address. A
Mm-hmm.
general culture of violence and a general culture of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that a lot of people in Liberia have not really healed. And even this is for people in the diaspora, right? Because even if you're in the diaspora, you can still suffer from that PTSD, even if you were in the diaspora the whole time of the conflict.
Yeah.
As a society, we are suffering from PTSD, the trauma that we've gone through. And there's some level of trauma that even happened before the war, right? The social and ethnic inequalities that were just normal. That's what we consider structural violence. It may not be a physical violence, but a structural violence is grave inequality. Growing up in poverty is an example of violence. It's a structural violence that people have to confront. So we just have a lot of trauma existing in our society, and violence is one of the ways that trauma expresses itself. And definitely, gender-based violence became. I mean, of course, gender-based violence was an issue before the conflict, right? But it became strongly exacerbated because of the way that our conflict used rape as a tool of war, which is characteristic of many conflicts across the world. Which is why there have been so many different resolutions. For example, Resolution 1325 with women, peace, and security, knowing that sexual violence, somehow rape becomes a tool of war. And so it's very important to be mindful of it and to prevent it. And then once it happens, to remedy it um, in part of the way that we reconcile and that we rebuild our social cohesion.
Okay. All right. So, if you don't mind, how have male politicians in Liberia influenced gender norms, and what are some examples of the positive change? I added a, if you don't mind, part because I was going to ask if you have examples of male politicians who have taken significant steps towards gender equality. If you don't have, that's okay. But I would like you to tell us how has male politicians in Liberia influenced gender norms, and what are some examples of positive influence of male politicians, um, such as supporting female leadership and advocating against GBV. Are there examples of some male
Mhm.
politicians like that?
Sure. I think the first thing to state is that all politicians have an impact on gender roles and gender norms, right? Female
Mhm.
and male. And because politicians as a whole are leaders, and so leaders make decisions in terms of policies. They make public statements that
Yeah.
get carried in the media, that influence public opinion. So leadership, of course, really this is what this is about. It's about leadership. And so those in positions of leadership have a lot of influence on shaping gender norms, shaping culture, shaping what's considered to be normal. The same way that President Sirleaf, by her sheer example of being a female leader, helped to shape those norms. So I think that's an important thing to state, that all politicians, and then majority of our politicians are male, right? And so they have a lot of influence in shaping gender norms by representation, by example, by their behavior, by the policies that they make, the legislative actions that they take. There are many gendered issues that they have to vote on a daily basis. And so every day they make certain decisions that are very gendered. Those of us who study gender, we know
Yeah.
that so many things are gendered. Everything, almost
Yeah.
everything is gendered.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few things that are not gendered, meaning that when you look at it through a gender lens, you will always notice that in
Yes.
society, things are very gendered. Gender has an
You have to,
influence on so
yeah, you have
much.
to be conscious of that first. Yeah, if
Yes.
the consciousness is there.
Yes, exactly. And so, there are male politicians. So, for example, there was this 30%, we've talked about it already, the 30% quota that was advocating for 30% of women on party tickets, and 30% of women in parliament, or in the Senate or in the House, reserving seats, which is something that's been happening across Africa. And there were male politicians who voted yes on that bill. Eventually, the bill didn't pass. So there were not enough men who voted on that bill for it to pass. And I think actually it was vetoed by the president, if I'm not mistaken. And which is what led a lot of people to criticize that president. We have said he was the feminist in chief, but then he vetoed the bill, right? Which contradicted his feminist in chief statement, because if he was a feminist in chief, wouldn't he have really pushed and advocated and passed that 30% quota bill? And so, but yet and still, there were many men, maybe not enough, but there were men in the Senate or in the House of Representatives who signed that bill, who said, yes, there should be a quota for at least 30% of women to be represented in political parties and in parliament. So that's an example of pro feminist men, all of the men who signed that
Okay.
bill who said yes. There's also, we know that there's an FGM bill um, that is, I think, is still on the floor. We know there was an executive order that President Weah signed for preventing FGM and or encouraging banning FGM. It was an FGM ban, but it was an executive order, and so that executive order expires a year from its date. I think probably by now it has expired, and of course, the executive order expires also because he's no longer in the executive. And so that was an example of a pro-feminist or pro-gender equality action um,
Okay.
to ban FGM, because there have been so many people advocating for the banning of FGM. And that was another interesting finding in this study that showed the social transformation that's happening in Liberia. And one
Mm.
of our participants mentioned it. He mentioned that in the past, you could not discuss FGM, especially in the rural context. And he gave an example of a radio station that was burned down shortly after they discussed FGM. And he explained the story that it was a he for she movement that had just started in Liberia, basically meaning men who advocate for women's rights in Liberia. And it's a UN slogan and campaign called He for She, right? So when we talk
Mhm.
about feminism in Liberia, or men who are pro gender equality or who have positive masculinity, in the way we define it here is it's he for she, women who
Okay.
support gender equality. And so somebody was explaining to us that, there was a he for she campaign going on, and some men who were he for she were on the radio saying, planning to talk about FGM, and they were warned, don't do that. Don't go on the radio. Don't talk about FGM. This is something that's in our secret societies. It's not something that should be voiced. We don't want it to be discussed. And they went forward anyway, and the radio station was burned down. And they saw that as a direct consequence of discussing FGM. And so that was maybe 20 years ago or so. Whereas now FGM has become something that we're constantly talking about. Even the head of Liberian elders, Zanzankawa, spoke about it, about ending FGM, and said that he was against FGM. The female practitioners of FGM came out and said that they wanted other sources of livelihood, and they were willing to put down their tools, right? So this FGM has now become this point of discussion in Liberia, that's on the radio, that's in the newspaper, which is something we would have never imagined before, right? And so that was a way of understanding that there's been an evolution, there's been a social transformation around gender equality in Liberia for the positive. Things that were taboo to discuss before are becoming less taboo to discuss now. So, as an example, and so the FGM bill, being on the floor, being discussed, some male politicians promoting it. One of our participants, our male politicians that we interviewed, mentioned. And we would not generally call the name of the person, because if they want to be known, they can come out and say that they were part of the study. But in terms of
Okay.
confidentiality, we don't just call out the name of the participants. Um, but they sponsored, the FGM bill, and they were pro the sponsoring of the FGM bill. And so there are many male politicians, though they would not call themselves feminists, and maybe their motivations are the strong women in their lives. Maybe it's a moral imperative
Moral
that
imperative. Mm-hmm.
they feel that Liberia needs this progress. We need to progress as a nation. We have to develop. We have things to do. We need women on board. There's many motivations, but we definitely see that there's social transformation happening, and more men that are pro gender equality, even if they don't call themselves feminists.
Okay. All right. So, some key policy recommendations. What are the key policy recommendations from your research that can help promote gender equality in Liberia?
One of the key ones that was just the most obvious, and in development we always say raising awareness is free. It's a shame that more development projects and activities don't really focus on awareness raising, because it's a free, or at least affordable um, tool for change. Really raising awareness around the importance of gender equality and feminism, and re-educating people around what feminism actually is, right? I think there's a lot of ignorance around that word. That word is very loaded, because it can mean just advocating for women's rights, but it can also refer to these large social movements that have happened. um, you have first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave. You have African feminism. You have Black womanism, which is also very important. We use the word feminism, but there are some Black women who prefer Black womanism, and saying that feminism was really started by white feminists, and that their issues were not the same as Black women's issues because of
That's where I
oppression.
stand.
Yeah, but no matter how you call it, it really is advocating for women's
Women's
political, economic, and social rights and human
exactly.
rights generally. So that's one of the key recommendations, that it seems obvious, but there's not enough of that happening in this podcast. Thank you for having me on to discuss it. That's an example, right? Really demystifying feminism and helping people to understand what it really just means is that advocating for women and their rights as equal to men, not even pushing women to be better than men, or to pushing women ahead of men, which is what some people assume it means, but that really trying to level the playing field between women and men, so that women are able to advocate for their rights and be equal participants in society, and equal recipients of goods and services from the state as well, right? Being able to have access to maternal care, for example, which we know is a big challenge in Liberia. And so that was one of the major recommendations, and also tailoring that to our context, right? Kind of a palava hut or peace hut, or town hall type discussion that will take um, the pressure off everyone feeling that you have to know everything, right? We need more room for just discussion and debate and learning, and safe space for people to ask quote unquote stupid questions, right? There's no stupid question, right? We are raised and socialized in a patriarchal system, And so a lot of women are also very patriarchal in their understanding. And that's normal because that's the way of the world, unfortunately. And Liberia is no exception. So really just having more discussion, raising more awareness about what gender equality is, why it's important for national development, for our progress as a nation and as a people. That's a very important and easy way to promote gender equality. Also, we know that you have these pro-feminist men, um, or these gender advocates, or these he for she's. We have male politicians who are he for she. And so, how can we amplify their voice? How can we have them demonstrating and modeling that behavior? Some of them get that. We had one politician who spoke to us, and he said that he had been promoting some gender equality initiative, and he was set to travel when there was a guest coming, I think an international donor or actor coming along similar lines of what he had been advocating for. And he had to cancel his trip because he knew that he had been saying it. And if he wasn't there and traveled at the same time as this important event, people would think that he was just saying it, but when he wasn't really behind it. And so he knew that he had to stand behind his word and be present and be counted when that particular gender equality initiative came up. And so that's an example of a male politician modeling that positive he for she behavior, right? And saying, no, I stand for this, not just in my word, but my action. And I'm going to be present. I'm going to push through this initiative because I really do believe that this is something that's important for the progress of our country. And so you have those examples of men who can model that behavior for other male politicians. So helping them to get together and do just that. And having these male politicians, for example, who voted for the 30% quota, to share why. Why did you vote for the 30% quota? Why do you think women's representation is important? Why aren't we amplifying more of those voices? Why aren't we hearing from those men? Why aren't those men really actively in the debate, helping other male politicians and the broader public to see from their perspective why they think that's important? It doesn't have to always be women advocating for women's rights. There are men who are also advocating for women's rights. You have he for she's, though they may be in a minority now, but there is room for that to grow, and it is growing slowly but surely. I sit on the board, for example, of an organization called Liberian Dads for Gender Equality. And this is a group of Liberian men who exhibit positive masculinity, right? They are fathers, they like to take care of their children, and they're helping to dispel the notion that men can't do caretaking of their own children. And there were many of them were part of an exhibition that the Swedish government did, which was called Swedish Dads. And then they started a program here called Liberian Dads, really. And it was a photography exhibition that showed Liberian men changing diaper, taking care of their children, taking the child out to the beach, taking the child to the park, which, when you live in Liberia, you see it. Of course, we know it. I've seen Liberian men with babies on their backs, and how do we really change the narrative about what it means to be a man? That's why the study of masculinities is so important and it's so interesting. What does it mean to be a man in Liberian society? Who gets to decide that? And does that not get to change? So everything will be changing. We have internet now, but men don't change. Men's roles don't change. Men's roles in the family don't change. Everything changes, but that remains static. How is that possible?
Right.
Everything is transforming in our society, and men's roles also need to transform. But Priscilla, I find that when I do gender sensitivity training with men, a lot of the men, when I ask them, I say, but what is the disadvantage of being a man in our society? Because everybody believes that the men are winning. They do everything. They have all the power. They're in control. But is it really that easy? Is it good? Is it easy being a Liberian man? And many men will tell you it is not easy carrying that weight, that burden financially. We know the reality of our context and our economic challenges that we have. Being the sole breadwinner in a family is a heavy weight. You are responsible for sending all of your children to school, for providing. What if you're unemployed? We have very high unemployment rates, or even higher underemployment rates, meaning that you're actually employed, but the money that you bring in cannot suffice, right? So being a Liberian man also comes with a lot of pressures. But are we really understanding, again, unpacking masculinities, right? Are we really understanding what does it mean to be a man in Liberian society? How do Liberian men feel about um, their own roles, and how would they like their own roles to shift? So I think one of the implications for from the research is to do more research, to have a better understanding of what it means to be a Liberian man, and hear from Liberian men about, what it means um, to advocate for gender equality, to share that with other men. And speaking of that, and as an extension, one of the recommendation talks about he for she organizations. You have some he for she organizations, and for some reason right now I can't recall the specific names besides the Liberian Diaspora Gender Equality that I mentioned earlier. There's another organization that I forget the name of, but they do a lot of advocacy, he for she advocacy, getting young men together, for example, talking about why it's important to stop violence in the home, why it's important to let women participate. But I find that, at least from in our research, that they tend to focus more on gender-based violence for good reason, because that's very important and that's an urgency in our context. And so a lot of the he for she organizations tend to focus on gender-based violence, but they don't get involved in the political realm. Maybe it's the lack of funding, maybe they don't feel versed with the capacity to talk, in the political space to advocate for the 38% quota bill, because women's organizations can do it and are doing it. But it would be great, I think, and more impactful if you have organizations of men who are promoting gender equality and promoting positive masculinity come up and advocate for women's political participation, or having more women in the political space. Um, yeah, so those are some of the key recommendations that came out of the study.
Wow. Oh, that would sounds like a lot of great work that you have done. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say, um, yeah, I agree with you when it comes to being a Liberian man. Just yeah, talking to close to me, milk, relations, whether friends or brother or relative. You hear that? Um, no, not you. People always think their mother or their sister or their spouse is the exception, but it's just because our mother was like this. Like, okay, I said this, so maybe I exposed my brother, but I remember our mother doing this, so that's why I believe. So yeah, and I've heard friends tell me that too. That my spouse, my mother, my sisters made me who I am today. Just in recent
Mhm.
time, one really, yeah, the God is doing really well in our community was saying that. So, if it has to take moral imperative, if it has to take strong women as relations influence to get men involved, hopefully we will experience a shift as we continue to engage like this.
And Priscilla, you reminded me of another recommendation, which is to share women's lived experience
Okay,
with
yeah,
men
so
and
that
with
one.
male politicians. Because, for example, I can tell you, oh, gender-based violence is bad, or I can tell you, oh, FGM is bad, and you might understand it theoretically, but
Yeah.
it may not really hold you or touch you in an emotional place that makes you really passionate about it or makes you want to do something about it. Um, and so, for example, and actually, I think one male politician mentioned this. He said, a woman came in who had suffered from FGM, and she explained to us her own experience. And that really had an impact on me. From that day, I became a proponent of the FGM ban, because I really got to really see the impact, and I saw the woman, and I felt really sorrowful, and she really had an impact. And so women also have to be brave and bold enough to tell their stories. Of course, there's a danger of re-traumatization, right? That can happen. In our context, we don't often think about psychosocial support or not re-traumatizing. But women who feel strong enough to be able to share those experiences, it's very important that we share them, because that really has more of an impact than me just saying, oh, I'm a feminist and feminism says, it's valid. It's very valid. But we don't just want to be feminists in theory. We want change in our context. And what will change in our context, what will create change in our context is sometimes women, one of the angles is multiple approaches, but one of the things that would have an impact in making more men and male politicians as a whole um, advocate is for them to really understand from women's personal experiences why this is detrimental. But that also means more dialogue has to happen. The men have to also be willing to listen to women and to listen openly, which is why we're advocating for kind of palava hut, peace hut, our own models, a Thai shop, type discussion where it's not like we're in a formal setting, but we can be in an informal setting and we can really share genuinely as Liberians and say, this was my experience. And this is why I'm advocating for this, because in my experience, this had this impact in my life, and this had a traumatic influence on me. So to make those experiences more real, so that men can empathize more, to create more empathy and compassion based on women's real experiences, and not just feminism as a theory.
Oh, you're frozen. Oh, okay. Yeah. So the link of the report is in the comments. If you're just joining us, we are wrapping up now. You can go ahead and rewatch it. I want to, for respect of our time, I want to stick to 1 hour, unless Tanya want to go beyond, but I talked to her for just 1 hour. And we'll continue to have these kind of conversations. I mean, the need to have these kind of conversation and research and study cannot be overemphasized. So if there is something that I didn't and touch on that you want to just share, please go ahead.
I mean, I think we've studied a lot of key findings from the report. I think maybe one thing we didn't discuss, and then, maybe if there are a few questions that you want to bring up, I'm happy to take maybe a few more minutes to answer some questions. But one thing that we didn't talk about um, is the patriarchal culture in politics. We talked about that a little bit, about how women are not really seen as good leaders and men are seen as good leaders. But
Mhm.
the students especially talked about cash violence, in our context. In fact, when I was talking about this with my other research partners, I just assumed that everyone knew what cash violence was, and they were like, "What's that?" I was like, "Oh, maybe that's a really a Liberian term," but cash violence meaning, using cash to really uh, get your way, or using um, money as a political power tool. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the young people especially said, our politicians use cash violence, that Liberian politics have become so transactional, that whoever has the money wins. And maybe
Mhm.
some would say that's global politics, or that's politics in different settings. But, a lot of other places have issue-based politics. And that's something that we're discussing with the other researchers from the other country context. And they were asking us, oh, but if you were to classify Liberia from like left to right politics, and I said, I don't know, can we classify Liberian politics as right? The way that you do in the US, kind of conservative politics versus liberal politics, and then center politics. Liberia, we don't really have issue based politics in that way.
No, no.
And one of my colleagues at the university helped me to peer review. Um, and he confirmed, he said, no, you can't really. And I think the
Mhm.
researchers were like, really? I'm like, no, Liberian politics. And it makes sense because the young people were telling us our politics are not issue based politics. It's cash violence. Whoever has the money wins. It's not issue based to say that, oh, I'm going to run on a gender equality platform, or I'm going to
Mhm.
run on a feminist platform, or I'm going
That
to
kept
run on.
frustrating me when I kept like, why can our, us just stand together this time around? If any party that does not meet the 30% quota, we can just strike them up. But like you said, no, we don't vote like that.
No, we don't. Although it's interesting, I put a table in the report, and it's a bit outdated. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a newer one that NEC did, where you have all of the political parties who are registered and the
Hmm.
percent of women that they presented on the ballot. And we
Yeah.
kind of highlighted those core parties that tend to have more women on the ballot. And they are your more well-known parties. A Liberty Party, Unity Party, CDC,
Hmm.
and there was another one that have more women, on the ballot. So you do have those parties that's the most we could say to find. Do we have any that have a feminist
What's
platform? No.
wasn't it? What's her name? She later joined um the current president now, and referred to herself as rescue somebody. I interviewed her before.
Oh,
Copper was
Magdala
in
Cooper.
Copper's party. Yeah.
I'm looking. I was trying to pull up the table quickly to see um, which parties they were. Um, let's see. So that they it basically it was candidate representation by political parties. So the number of female candidates
Okay.
that had been represented from 2005 to 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And CDC had 11% female candidates. Liberty Party had 12%. Unity Party had 16%, and independent, those who ran as independents were 14%.
Okay.
Um, and so there were others that were, maybe 11%. No, let's see, um, 3%, 2%, 4%, but really the highest, those were the four, the three parties and then independent of those who really advocated and had women as candidates on their ballot. And so that also sets those parties apart. Those were that's the closest we could get to saying, these are kind of the pro gender equality parties, or the ones that actually put forward the most female candidates. So that was interesting, the use of, cash. And because why it's important for gender norms is because we know that globally, and also very much in Liberia, women are not, there's a gender pay gap. Women do not earn, they don't earn on equal terms as men. And even in societies that are quite gender equal, Sweden, the United States, that's like the final frontier of gender equality, that we may have gender equality in every other way, but that gender pay gap, to close it, is very,
You
very
know,
difficult. And
yeah,
so women just
United
don't
States.
earn as much as men. Yeah, for multiple reasons that could take up a whole nother hour. Women don't earn as much as men. So if politics are very cash focused, then how do women compete, right? If it's only cash
Right.
based. Yeah. So that was another key finding that I don't think we mentioned. Um, but other than that, I think we've
Okay.
covered a lot of ground, unless you have a few questions.
Maternal activism. I know the names is obvious in the name, but you want to just go into that. I mention it in passing when I talk about somebody saying, my mother was this, but please tell us a little bit about maternal activism, the maternal doing, especially during the Liberian civil conflict, how effective this strategy today in promoting gender equality.
And I wrote a paper on that, and I think we might have discussed it the last time. Maternal activism is an interesting concept.
Yeah, that's very much
That Yeah, that says that some women's movements, when they advocate for equal rights, they do it in their roles as mothers. And so we saw that a lot in the Liberian civil conflict, where we had, the women marching, the women's movement, the women peace building movement. We all saw them, in Lapa and white t-shirts, um, at the airfield, advocating and protesting. They really use their roles as mothers to appeal to the sensitivity as Liberians, because in Liberians, we tend to have a reverence for mothers, right? We have a lot of respect for mothers. And Lima Bowie spoke about this in her book, Mighty Be Their Powers, and in the documentary, Pray the Devil Back to Hell. There's a really
Mhm.
famous excerpt from that movie that
Yeah, where
explains that,
they
yes,
went
if,
and
if a
collected
mother,
the guys, disarm to them because they were refusing to
exactly.
disarm to the UN. But when the women show up, they disarm to them.
And generally in our society, because we revere our elders, there's a respect for mothers. And so if you upset a mother, or she gets to her last nerve and she would threaten to undress herself, it's like, I can't get to you any other way. I'm just gonna strip. That's like the biggest offense, right, in African society. So, and especially in Liberian society. And so because of our sensitivity to our mothers, our respect and love for our mothers, the Liberian women, I mean, it was natural for them. I think it was not necessarily like a strategy, but because of our political context and our social context, where mothers are revered, women use their maternity as a way of advocating. The issue with that younger generations who are not mothers, for example, what do they use? If I'm not a mother and I'm a young woman, nobody's
Hmm.
respecting me as somebody's mom, and
Yes.
I'm the one, because it's younger women that suffer more from gender-based violence in our context
I'm
too.
human being too.
So
Yeah, I don't have to be somebody's mom.
exactly. And so the younger feminists and activists usually say, well, that's not an effective tool in the long run, and it might have been useful for the peacemakers at that time, and it worked because it helped to really change the trajectory of the Liberian civil conflict, and we are indebted to those women who advocated and used that strategy as a tool. But it doesn't work to really unpack the patriarchy because it still plays into woman as mother. You can only be respected, you can only be listened to if you're somebody man. If you're a younger Liberian woman, it doesn't matter. You know, if I go to a politician's office to advocate for something, he might be looking at my body, or he might be objectifying me, or he might be trying to take me out to lunch, or, you know, it's not an effective tool for a younger woman to use because in our society, we revere our mothers in a different way than that we revere younger women. And so some people would say that it's not a long-term strategy for unpacking patriarchy because it plays into this idea that mothers are revered as holy, but everybody else is not. And so it's not, it doesn't change the status quo sufficiently. But that
Mm,
concept is called maternal activism, and there's been a lot written about that and how it was an effective tool in our context.
yeah, and that your whole humanity is tied, as a woman, is tied into motherhood. If you're
Right.
not a
And
mother, yeah,
it narrows the possibility for women. We talked about intersectionality, right?
yeah,
I can be a mother, but I can also be a wife. I can also be a girlfriend. I can be a feminist. I can also love to cook. I can, we like to kind of oversimplify women and men. And that's the problem with gender roles, right? Is this oversimplification and this box. Sometimes when we teach gender, we talk about the gender box. You're putting me in a box that doesn't allow me to express myself freely. Also, because I'm a woman, I have to only be interested in children and cooking. I can't be interested in politics or leadership, right?
mm,
Because I'm a feminist, I'm only interested in woman business. I'm not interested, I can't also want a healthy marriage, and I can't also want to have children. We tend to essentialize and kind of reduce people to these norms and these roles and these labels that doesn't allow them to exist in their reality, which is that we all wear different hats, we all play different roles, we all have a unique expression of ourselves, and in order to live genuinely, we should be allowed to express that. Even the men will say that when I interview or when I do a gender sensitivity training, they will say, well, I love to cook, but if I tell anybody I want to cook, they will laugh at me, and they say, oh, you woman, now you're in the kitchen. Even the men do that to each other. They put themselves in boxes, and they maintain those social norms and social roles, even, to the point where people can't live their genuine lives and be true to themselves. And that's the issue, really, with gender norms, the
yeah,
restrictiveness of them.
yeah. And a few years back, but I was in a Liberia, that was over here. I was doing a presentation addressing um, a situation like that when a Liberian was part of that, was asking, would say, um, is somebody mother? And I was pointing out, people do not have to be somebody's mother. Everybody is
Right.
somebody's mother. And I like, no. Family dynamics is change, is evolving around the world. In this very country, they have two dads. What if a child doesn't have a mother or something? So human rights should be respected because they are human beings, not because they're somebody's mother or somebody's father or gave birth. We
Right.
have evolving family dynamics now.
Mm-hmm. And I'm somebody's sister. I'm somebody's daughter, right?
Yeah,
But it's interesting because when we were, designing the research study, I was mentioning to my colleagues that maybe not be a bad thing. We see it as a bad thing. Like, yes, it's true that we should respect everybody's human rights. But again, something has to make it real to people, right? Because if you're not, in this realm of research or sociology, maybe you don't really think about it. But if saying, okay, I'm somebody's mother, I'm somebody's sister, I'm somebody's daughter, would you want this to happen to your daughter? Would you want this to happen to your sister? At this point, we are desperate for change, especially when it comes to gender based violence and stopping the violence. Whatever it takes to convince you that this violence shouldn't happen, that you should advocate and protect women, I'm ready to use it. I'm somebody's sister. I could be a sister. I could be a daughter. I could be a mother. You know, we need to make it real to people. And I think that however we do that, which is why I think maternal activism is one strategy. And
Okay.
it worked in our context. There's nothing wrong with it. It worked. And those we owe a lot of our peace to those women,
Yeah,
right?
oh
We owe
sure.
our peace to those, yeah, we owe our peace to those women. But I agree too that it's not enough. And there's still a lot of work to do, and we still have to unpack the patriarchy. We still have to advocate for women's rights. We still have to stop the violence by any means necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, hopefully we will have you back because you continue to be relentless in bringing about change in our one world. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much. If there is nothing else to add, um, maybe my last question will be what steps need to be, oh, I think you already addressed it when you say whatever it takes. I was going to say, what steps need to be taken to ensure the future of gender equality in Liberia, considering our current political and cultural context. But like you said, whatever it takes, if we will use maternal activism, anything else,
I think I would
just
say we
highlight
really,
as we
yeah, I
go
think we
home.
need to continue the dialogue as Liberians. I think we still have too much that separates us. We emphasize what separates us and not what brings us together. And I think we need to continue talking. We need to continue dialoguing. We need to continue progressing as a nation and as a society and be really interested in our progress. Because if we were really interested in our progress, if we put our national progress first, gender equality would be normal. It wouldn't even be a need to advocate because it's just progress. How do we evolve as a society? How do we make sure that all Liberians are enjoying the fruits, of Liberia? Because we have more than enough fruits, right?
Oh,
We're not a
that
poor
was going
country.
to be that was going to
Yeah,
be
we're
my
not a poor
question.
country. We're just poorly managed, as someone once said. We're not a poor country. We're just poorly managed. So there's enough for all of us, But how do we continue to build solidarity, to build cohesion, to understand what impacts one person impacts everyone, right? Because maybe you're a man, maybe you're a male politician, and you're not really focused on gender equality because you don't think it impacts you, but it impacts your sister, it impacts your mother, it impacts your daughter, your friends, your colleagues, right? So it's important for everyone. So I think if we put our national progress first, if we become jealous about our national progress, then I think we'll see positive change in many areas, including in gender equality.
I'm
So I
trying
think,
to complicate this your response a little. Say,
go ahead, go
um,
ahead.
if I was telling my mother, then she'd be like, "What do you need?" In my language, gender equality. That I can take to the market, and then I can just say it will impact. Or you're talking to a guy, it will impact your sister. It was how? So can you? Yeah, something tangible. How?
It comes back to my point, and when I do gender equality training, this is one of the things that I talk about. That in fact, gender inequality is we consider it the first inequality because they're different. There are many inequalities, right? Gender is only one, but within all other inequalities, okay, there's rural urban inequality, there's ethnic inequality, there's income inequality. You have lots of different inequalities, but any way you look at it, women are always at the bottom of every area. So women are really impacted by inequality in a different way, and more than others. So gender equality is really important, but especially for us as Liberians, we know the challenges that we face as a nation, right? When you look at all of and we talk about this briefly in the report, the Human Development Index, for example, and
That's
human
right.
development, where we're faring as human beings. If you take all the countries in the world and you put them on a scale from 1 to 200, because I think maybe 250 countries are part of this UN Human Development Index. Liberia is considered to be like almost the last country in that Human Development Index. So, as Liberians, we want to see ourselves progress. We want to see us, reach a point where we can say, yes, we have, as a nation, as a people, we are developed as human beings, right? So when they do that index, they don't look at your tribe, they don't look at whether you're in rural or urban area. Is Human Development Index as Liberia as a whole, we are considered to be at the very bottom of human development.
So how
So
would my mother experience that development on her level, the human
how was she?
development? How
Yeah.
would my
So my
mother
point is
experience them?
My
Mhm.
point is that development means that our lives improve, right?
Okay.
It means that we have the resources that we need. We have access to healthcare. We have access to
Okay.
education. We have money, right? Because it takes people working. If all the women are not working, they're at home, and only men are working, that means the entire burden of our development rests on the men,
Okay.
right? Liberia is only a population of 5 million. That's my point about two hands clapping. We need
Okay.
everybody up. We need everybody educated. We need everybody working. We need everybody moving towards and progressing Liberia. We don't have the luxury of Nigeria. We don't have that kind of population. We are less than 6 million, and we need everybody on board. So it's important for girl children to be in school. It's important for women to be working, for women to be educated, for women to be part of the development process. We need everybody on board in order to progress ourselves as a nation, right? And so that's the argument for full participation. We need everybody employed, we need everybody working, we need everybody deciding, we need
Some
everybody
business.
pushing Liberia forward. Yeah, so that together we can bring Liberia forward. I think that's the point. And that's what makes it real. And so when I do gender sensitivity training, especially in rural areas, I don't start with feminism. I start with development. I start with national development. How do we progress? How do we move forward? How do we get to the next level of how will we be left behind? Why are we constantly left behind in development progress? If you go to Cote d'Ivoire, you go to Ghana, you go to other countries, you see the progress, even in our very region. Why is it that we are left behind? We're left behind because we're not really developing ourselves. We're not really investing in our education. We're not investing in our citizens. We're letting inequalities, we're letting gender, we're letting tribe and ethnicity hold back our progress, and we're being left behind on a human development scale. And so it's important for us all to get together and to push each other forward. And we don't have the luxury of only men being progressed or progressing. We need everybody to progress. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I forgot that part and I wanted to throw it in quick. So I think if I distracted you, you were going somewhere then. I don't know whether I interrupted your train of thought. But
No,
yeah,
no, no, no.
I needed the old man to understand this gender equality thing. Yeah, so what does that mean for me? How can you how does it translate to me down there?
Mm-hmm.
Um but yes, so thank you again. Thank you so much. You are continue to be generous with your time. We appreciate that. We were able to be, we were able to be like in the first group of people in May to hold the report and talk about it. Please feel free whenever there is something you need to share with our community. You need to teach us. All of us are now your class. I mean, your students. We cannot afford to be at the Bamangida school or other universities you're teaching art, but Focus on Liberia is here as a platform that at least every now and then you can just share your insights with us and expertise and just enlighten us. So thank you for joining us today, Tanya.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you for having me.
Okay,
And thank you for this platform.
of course. Okay, thank you, Dennis. You yeah, Tanya said thank you for this platform. So and
Yes.
thank
Thank
you,
you,
our
Dennis.
viewers. Sorry, go ahead.
I said thank you, Dennis. I was repeating the thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on a new day. Thank you for being a change and for sharing your day with us. Thanks to our viewers for joining us. Let's continue the dialogue, elevate our voices, and actively participate in shaping a world where social justice isn't just an aspiration, but a reality. Join us next time on A New Day as we continue to explore and advocate for social reform. Remember, change begins with a conversation. And as Tanya said, let's continue to talk about, let's continue to dialogue. So let's make every day a new day for progress. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. It's a new day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.